So what is Angel City Press?
We are a 26-year-old publishing company that specializes in the social and cultural history of Southern California. We've been doing this because we fell in love with Southern California. Neither of us were born here, we're not natives, but we are third-generation Californians. And when we discovered Los Angeles back in 1970-ish, we fell in love with the place and decided that it had a history that we wanted to share.
And what was the story behind Angel City Press? How did you guys come together, and what was your goal when starting this company?
We found ourselves together with two other friends and thought, like, we like some local books. One of them had published a book about beach volleyball with a beach volleyball guy who still lives down the street from us here. And it just sold like hotcakes. And we said, well, let's do other stuff about Los Angeles. And the four of us were together in this publishing company, and pretty soon it was three and then two of us, because it's a lot of work. And Patty and I remained. We're married, and we had figured out the interpersonal part of the challenges ahead of time. So by about 3 years into the company, it was pretty much us. And we found ourselves less interested in the gift-oriented books and more interested in the books that had to do with the history of where we live.
So what kind of books do you publish?
We generally do coffee table style books. They're predominantly visual, lots of pictures, lots of historical images. In fact, we did one on the history of Santa Monica Beach. And that book went on to 3 or 4 printings. It's a fabulous collector's edition. And because of that book, our author, who was born here and whose relatives had owned the land grant, the Mexican land grant, that was Santa Monica way back, his collection of photographs was purchased by the Huntington Museum. That purchase made news all over the world. So we were pretty proud of that.
Are there any other examples of the types of books you put out?
Well, anything that did a book like this with the Los Angeles Central Library. It's a history of the library. Scott, tell him about...
A friend of ours, when he was a teenager, he's about our age, so this was in the day, lived above the Sunset Strip. And he was a gawky kid, and he would walk around with his camera as a way of just being, and took a lot of photographs of the rock and roll billboards that were there, starting in essentially 1970s, early 1970s. And he became a professional photographer. And over time, whenever he would show his photos to people, they always looked at these pictures. And he came to us and said, how about doing a book? And we worked with him and did that, and that's this book, Rock and Roll Billboards. That's typical. This, we decided to make more than just a pictorial book, because it's a story about a form of advertising that doesn't exist anymore, which is hand-painted billboards. And also kind of a story about a potential for advertising that also doesn't exist anymore, which is a lot of money for unknown musical artists. That was a particular time in history, and this was a venue where people who were in the industry would look at these signs, and much more so than all the rest of us looking at these signs. That's what it was for.
You can see the era of the billboards. And interesting about this was that it was right around, the photo was taken right around the time that people were saying, Paul is dead. And in the middle of the night one night, some pranksters came and chopped off Paul's head. So we had 3 Beatles and a headless Paul. So that made the news, of course. They never found the head. But when the book came out, we put out the word that we wanted to know if anybody still had the head. And sure enough, 40 years later, somebody turned up at the book launch with Paul's head. So our books have an impact.
that person brought the head, and the artist who painted the head was there. He was in his 90s at the time. And they conversed, but basically the conversation was, why did you take my head? Very interesting. It's fun.
So why did he take the head?
Just for fun. Just crazy kids. Just Crazy Kids, but it made international news at the time. And then it was just wonderful for the artist to finally be able to say, "Darn it, why did you do that?"
And ironically, that piece of art, even though it's only the head, is the only preserved hand-painted billboard. They would recycle these. The sign companies would take the billboards down, whitewash them, and use them over again. So all this work only existed photographically, and with the exception of this stolen piece of it.
One of the things we like to do is focus on topics that perhaps wouldn't ordinarily get covered. And a few years ago, we were approached by the California Historical Society and La Plaza de Cultura y Artes downtown to do a book with them about murals that were done by Latin American Chicano and Chicana artists throughout Los Angeles that have disappeared over time. Maybe for political reasons, maybe for reasons of progress, quote unquote. But this book is really one of our favorites. It's just a really beautiful book about things that can never be seen again here in Los Angeles. And it's gone on to win several prizes. But we're very proud of it because it tells a story that otherwise would be lost to history. And that's Murales Rebeldes.
What makes Angel City Press unique compared to other publishing houses across the country?
I think mainly because we work so closely with our authors. Many times at larger publishing companies, authors will turn in their manuscript and they won't hear anything about it for months. They'll finally get it back. There'll be a bunch of questions posed inside of it. They won't know how the editors feel about the project. Our authors know exactly where they stand right along the process because we're working with them very, very closely.
How about in terms of the topics you cover and the materials you put out? Is anything unique about that?
Well, because our books are always focused on something about Southern California, that makes us very unique, sets us apart from almost any other publisher in the world. We do books about niches of Southern California history. When we see a book that's titled Los Angeles, we kind of laugh because that would have to be a book that's 30,000 pages long. Instead, we take a small part of Los Angeles and expand upon it and give a clear history.
This process has become one of these. It's like a very narrow master's degree in each of these topics, and we feel like we're the sort of the two students often of the person who knows the most about it, who's our author, and sometimes discovering along the way, because now we've done about 100 titles, and there has been enough overlap that we can say, oh, well, that has to do with this other thing we did 5 years ago. And sometimes the authors know one another, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's a 1% overlap, but sometimes it's a 10% overlap, and that gets interesting. It's very interesting when we find the interplay of, oh, there's land politics that's about building this stuff, but this stuff may be some civic center, and that other stuff may be housing, and the land politics didn't have much to do with it. The pieces didn't have much to do with each other at the time, but now what we see is what's left, and we find, oh, well, these people that historically were involved in these two things had something to say about the other one, and often the authors didn't know that.
Why is it important to have local authors telling these local stories?
I think it's important to have local authors working on local stories because they add a real credibility to it. They've come up with questions over the scope of their lives, so they want to find answers for them, and they're going to be the people who really research the deepest. You know, you can have someone come in from another city and look at Los Angeles, but do they really understand it if they haven't lived here? I don't think so.
There is that element. It's almost like there's a term for it in the movies. I don't recall it exactly at the moment, but where things are the way they're supposed to look. And it's just, it's more about the understanding that there was the depth of knowledge so that what is being told on top of that is, it's clear that the author has thought it through. So one example that we laugh at is that we published a book called 29 Palms, which is about a grisly book and very interesting about murders in the Mojave, but there was a thing that the New York publisher who first published the book didn't catch, which was that these two freeways that were supposed to go from one spot to another on some aspect of traveling around to the protagonist of this book did not intersect. In another case, there was talk about the LA gangs, the Crips and the Bloods, and they got the colors wrong. Well, if you get the colors wrong and you are from the place, you're not going to trust the book. So there's a certain amount of that, and that's really why it's so unusual to see that, because so many of our authors have this incredible depth of knowledge. Patty mentioned Ernie Marquez, who lamented to us a few years ago that he couldn't remember every last fact about some things about the history of Santa Monica from 1925, which was when he was 5 years old. And these are facts that normally would be third-level footnotes in a history book. It's amazing.
With his book, I was assembling the bibliography for him, and I said, Ernie, there aren't any books here. And he said, books? No, I really didn't read any books about the topic. I read every issue of the Santa Monica Evening Outlook from 1875. So that's the kind of research that our authors do. They get compulsive, but it's because they're so into their topic. And we're there to just help them along.
Similarly, why is it important for locals of the community to read books about their community and their community history?
It's important, I think, that people who live in a community read about their community history, not just to know who did what, when, where, and when was this building built and which architect did that, but to get a sense of how their community developed. Los Angeles has this reputation of being a community of immigrants to the city, not just immigrants to the country, and outsiders, but there are far more people here who have been here a long time than in a lot of metropolitan areas around the U.S. A lot of people, his families have been here for 100 years. Sure, there are people who just moved here from New York and decided to write about Los Angeles. But if you take those people out of the mix, most of the people have been here for a long time. And they have a sense that, oh, I know that used to be there and this thing changed and there was this department store chain that was called Bullock's and now it's gone. And I wonder who those people were. And so they could find out from a book like ours about how that evolved over time, what happened to the things that are gone, why are they gone, why did we run out of housing at certain times and then seem to have a lot of housing at other times. Right now we don't seem to have enough housing, but that's not such a simple answer. You know, if there were enough money to pay for the housing, there would be housing. Times in the past there have been not enough money to pay for the housing and something or another happened and it changed.
And if you make history accessible, it encourages people to have a pride of place, to understand why they love living in a particular place, what went on before. People notoriously say that there's no history in Los Angeles, and we're really out here to prove them wrong.
So 26 years in the book publishing industry, what's changed over that time?
Amazon.
Mm-hmm. And the big box store, the big chain bookstores before that. It's the same story, I think, of there is a given set of sellers and buyers and middle people, entities, and they change over time. And we could be telling the story of, selling hi-fi gear, and it would be the same story. We could be telling the story probably of selling groceries 2 generations ago, and that would be the same story as it is selling books today. What we see, though, is that it already happened before we began 26 years ago, the potential to develop a high quality product with relatively low difficulty. And that is because of desktop publishing and because of relatively inexpensive, relatively short run, in our case, for the books like this, high quality color printing. But that doesn't solve the marketing problem, which is how you have to find somebody to buy what you have. And also, there's the kind of product quality problem, which is that if you have an idea for a book and it's an idea that is not well thought through, it doesn't matter how beautifully manufactured it is, it's not going to be available in the marketplace. It's not going to be a success. It won't, and however that's defined, it might not be a critical success, and certainly won't be an economic success over time. We have seen publishers come and go. We have certainly seen booksellers come and go, and that's an ongoing thing now. I think we're seeing the end of the chain bookstore world in the U.S., except for the one chain, which is Amazon, and that's not the same thing. It's not like saying this is different. I don't know what. It's a whole different ballgame.
When we started in business in 1992, Los Angeles was renowned for having the largest per capita book sales in the country. We had so many independent bookstores. You could go on to the Santa Monica Promenade and find 5 independent bookstores. Now we have a handful of wonderful independent bookstores in all of Los Angeles. And that is a big, big change. Now 80% of our books are sold on Amazon. That's a sad, sad statement. The kids aren't growing up going into bookstores, looking at all the possibilities that are there for them. It's a shame, but we persevere.
What are the current trends in the publishing world, and where do you see the industry going in the future?
I don't think we can address
No,
that
it's tough.
because we don't deal in trends.
So why don't you deal in trends?
We don't deal in trends because we want to create a document that people can look at for the next 20 years. We don't want a book that isn't saleable for a long period of time. We want a book that adds to the history of Southern California and isn't dealing with temporary moments. That's not our place. That's for other publishers to do.
It's a challenge. I mean, in a way, it's almost sounds self-serving, but we really want to make books that we'd like to have on our bookshelf and not have to say, oh, why is that on the bookshelf now? Because that's last year's thing. We have been tempted to do things that are involved in trends, but luckily we're so slow to react that we tend not to get involved in the trend before we realize the trend is over.
We once did a book on a famed shopping street here in Southern California. And we thought, wow, that's great. We'll do a guidebook to Rodeo Drive. We had 2 authors who were steeped in fashion, knew their topic so well. They wrote a wonderful book. But before it got back from the printer, there was a recession, and 50% of the stores on Rodeo Drive had changed. And there we were stuck with a lot of books that were out of date. So we learned a lesson and learned it the hard way.
So why is it important to have smaller, more local publishing houses like yourselves today?
When we started out in business, it was because I and another author, Betty Goodwin, had written a book called LA Inside Out. And it was published by a large New York publisher. And that publisher told us, the authors, this is the most beautiful book we've ever produced. And we were thrilled, just thrilled. They went through the publishing process. The salespeople, who were all based on the East Coast, said, nobody wants to read books about LA. because that wasn't their world. And so we decided after that experience that being a small publisher in a large fishbowl was a really good way to approach things. That way we can zero in on what's important to our area. And fortunately, our area is something that people internationally are interested in. They aren't restrained by the New York, LA competition. So we've been able to stay in business for 26 years because the world is interested in LA, and our customers believe that we know LA best.
We've found over the years compatriots and other publishers, some around Los Angeles. There are not a large number of publishers in Los Angeles. I don't know whether per capita or per whatever economic measure. It's certainly not concentrated like you would say in New York. But we have found around the West, there's a fantastic group that's called Pub West. It used to be Mountain and Plains Booksellers Association way back in the day. It was highly concentrated in the Mountain West and then in the Pacific Northwest. But now it is throughout the West. And we see these people once a year. They have a conference. We learn about industry stuff. We hear industry luminaries. And we compare notes. And the notes are all the same. And it doesn't matter whether you are the guys who publish books about the Grand Canyon, or publish books about the Cascades, or publish books about cooking for large families in the Mountain West, or publish books about history in Los Angeles. It's the same business challenges, which is how do I figure out how to make things work on a shoestring? How do I interact well with the authors? Where does the friendship and business relationship, how does that all work? Because it's no fun if it's just strictly a business relationship. If we wanted to be business relation people, we could probably have been bankers or stockbrokers or something. In the past, I was a tech guy, and that was all interesting, but it did not have the thrill of the interaction with people and finding that seeing their nobody was ever thrilled when a program worked. They were just relieved.
What do you want the audience to understand about the publishing process and your publishing process in particular?
I think that when I think about publishing here in Los Angeles, I realize that there is a story that is multifaceted, that it's not just a cultural story, it's not just a sports story, it's not just a social story. It's where all of these things come together. And I want people to read all of our books, see how they interlace. That's what we've learned over the course of all these years. We've seen that one thing plays against the next, and that's how this great metropolis was created. And we're really telling that story. That's what I want people to take away.
I think it's parallel to the notion of a whole bunch of suburbs in search of a city or whatever that trope is. It's really, but the whole point is these suburbs are never in search of a city. People were happy to be where they were and doing what they did. And that's what's the case with the various topics that we encounter and sometimes publish. And we keep finding more. There is some publishers, I think, have the problem like, well, okay, how am I going to do the next book on whatever? How do I make a series out of this? But we do not have that problem. It's quite the opposite. There is no end to stuff that we could publish. What may be frustrating a lot is how do we judge what is worthy of our time, what is worthy of our interest, and what we think we can sell? Because at the end of the day, we are not a nonprofit company. We have to break even. We don't want to go bankrupt. We want to keep doing this stuff. We don't, though, want to build something and sell something that belongs to an idea that we think someone else has. So there's that challenge there. It's really interesting to see that all throughout, anywhere you live, and I think Southern California is unique, there are people who have found their way and done something, and they quietly go about what they're doing, and maybe they're not so quiet because they're in the public sphere, but a lot of times people are very quiet, and they just did a fantastic job at doing what they did. Our job is to get that word out, and of course realize that there are things that are so narrow that the interest is too small for a general interest book. But that doesn't mean it's not interesting. So we then try to figure out how that fits into a bigger picture background.
There's been a history of small publishers in Los Angeles over many, many decades. And I think that we're just part of that history, the publishing history of Southern California. And we like to think of ourselves as a little library of Los Angeles.